Good morning, everyone. My name is Tina Asefa from Alcazaz Foundation. Today, for our Saturday monthly webinar, we have Dr. Aaida Mamuji joining us. Dr. Aaida Mamuji is a professor of disaster and emergency management at York University. Her research interests include policy and media responses to international and domestic humanitarian crises, with a current focus on wildfire evacuations and resettlement of Syrian refugees in Canada. She holds a PhD in public administration from the University of Ottawa. Dr. Aaida Mamuji today will be discussing Canada's 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire evacuation, experiences of the Muslim community. And with that, I will give it to you, Dr. Aaida. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. It's a pleasure, and the QED webinar series is always very, very interesting. So I look forward to sharing my work with you and hope I meet your expectations. I'm just going to share my screen right now. So can you see the presentation, Tina?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is Canada's 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire evacuation, and in particular, the experiences of the Muslim community. And this is just a quick overview of the agenda for my presentation. Now, there's no doubt that the 2016 wildfire in Fort McMurray is very, very significant for Canadian natural disaster history. It is also one of the largest evacuations that Canada has had. So just in terms of wildfire evacuations in the past, there have been 547 in this date range here from 1980 to 2007. But the Fort McMurray wildfire was the largest evacuation of a single municipality in Alberta's history. Now, we've had large evacuations in Canadian history. In November 1979, in Mississauga, Ontario, there was a train derailment and toxic release that had 215,000 people that were evacuated. And in Calgary, in June 2013, there were 100,000 people that were evacuated due to flooding. But the Fort McMurray wildfire evacuation was very significant because it was a situation that caused an entire city to evacuate. We're talking 88,000 people that were forced to flee from their homes and couldn't return for up to a month later. So what I have here is just a quick snapshot of the actual disaster. So the fire was first spotted around May 1st in the afternoon. And then high winds actually drove the fire into Fort McMurray on May the 3rd. And then between May the 3rd and May the 4th, all 88,000 persons and residents in Fort McMurray had to leave, except for those people that were considered to be essential personnel and first responders for the fire. Now, in terms of the fire impacts over the course of the 5 weeks that the fire was active, thankfully, there was 0 casualties directly from the fire. So although we had 88,000 people that had to evacuate, nobody died directly as a result of the wildfire, which is a major success. There was, unfortunately, though, a motor vehicle accident that caused the death of 2 individuals, but this was during the actual evacuation. The wildfire caused 589,000 hectares of land to be impacted. Almost 2,000 structures were lost and damaged. And in terms of economic impacts, they're estimated at $8.9 billion. Now, I'll just share an image here from when the residents were leaving Fort McMurray. I'm sure Canadians around the country remember seeing this image, and we were all shocked by the televised television coverage of the slow-moving traffic as people were leaving, and you could see that there were flames on either side of the cars when they were driving off. Now, just to give you some context, so you understand the evacuation circumstances, Fort McMurray is a remote northern community. And there's actually only one highway that either takes you up north to the oil sites, and there's actually a bridge over there called the Bridge to Nowhere. So you have all the oil industries there, and then basically nowhere else to go. Or you can go south, so north you go there. If you go south, you will hit either Edmonton or Calgary, and this is where most people ended up going when they had to evacuate. Now, another interesting observation is that when you're going south, there's actually no place for you to fill up gas for almost 200 kilometers. So one of the major issues that people experience when they're evacuating is that their cars were running out of gas. And so, just to keep things into context, it really took a very long time for all those 88,000 people to leave the city. And then many had to stop on the sides and then wait for people to come in with gas for them to continue on their journey. Now, where did everyone evacuate to? So of these 88,000 people, 88,000 residents that had to evacuate, they had a number of options. Primarily, they went to reception centers. Now, these reception centers were basically set up in airports, in stadiums, in schools, universities, and it was emergency services personnel receiving all these residents, providing them with food, providing them with clothing, and whatever other needs that they might have had. Now, as I mentioned, a large influx actually went into Edmonton and Calgary. And what happened was that because there were so many people coming in, all the hotels were over capacity. And most hotels were only renting out to residents for one night at a time. So, you just have to, even if you're a family of 5, let's say you got yourself a hotel room, you only have one night, and then the next night you have to see where you would be able to go. So what ended up happening is that emergency social services established several group lodging facilities. These are some examples: the Edmonton Expo Center, the Northlands Exhibition Center, University of Alberta, University of Calgary, McEwen University. And then we also had smaller evacuation centers set up by private entities, including faith groups, churches and mosques, and others. And as I mentioned, then the emergency management authorities began their liftoff of the evacuation order a month later. So during this entire month, some residents relied heavily on those emergency social services for the entire duration. Others, if they had insurance, they were able to get temporary housing, or many relied on family and friends and traveled across Canada to wait there before they could go back home. So, this is where the question arose, and I conducted this research with my colleague at the university, at York University, Professor Jack Roszilski, and we went to Fort McMurray a year after the evacuation to meet with the community and understand the circumstances of their evacuation and their return back to Fort McMurray. And one thing that we realized, that we know in general, first of all, is that when an entire geographic area is forced to evacuate, emergency social services are expected to serve multiple groups simultaneously. So whether you're a visible minority, a faith community, persons, people with disabilities, marginalized populations, or others that may require, may have some unique needs, emergency authorities are required to meet the needs of everyone. And that's what makes a whole of community approach to that response. So what happens in certain situations, because you have such diversity, especially in Canada, often these services are developed to meet the needs of the average citizen, however it is that the emergency management authorities understand the average to be. And this can result in a situation where certain needs are unmet. So what's interesting to note about whole of community evacuation research in Canada is that when it comes to minorities, much of the research that has occurred has looked at the Aboriginal community in Canada, and rightly so. So of the 547 wildfires that I mentioned happened between 1980 to 2007, 1/3 of them actually involve First Nations communities. And so there's a lot of research that looks at the evacuation experiences of First Nations peoples. But then there's little research that exists in Canada concerning the evacuation experiences of other minorities. And this is where our research came into question. So Fort McMurray is actually a very, very diverse community. And it's actually considered by some to be more diverse per capita than Toronto. Over 28% of the population self-identify as belonging to a visible minority group, and 23% are immigrants. There are 80 languages that are spoken in Fort McMurray. There's 34 places of worship, including churches, mosques, and synagogues. And what we noticed was that, and this was something that we came across without, we didn't know this was going to be the case until we investigated the wildfire and then realized that this was the situation. But the largest visible minority group in Fort McMurray is actually the Muslim community. So Muslims make up approximately 10% of the Fort McMurray population. And this is very large in comparison to the makeup of Muslims in Canada in general, which is 3%. Now, recent statistics on religious affiliation in Fort McMurray is not really available, but when you look at non-official immigrant languages that are spoken and other data that we were able to gather, we were able to confirm that approximately 10% of the population is Muslim. Now, Muslim families have been in Fort McMurray for over 30 years. Almost every single Friday, 1,500 to 2,000 people actually attend Friday prayers. During the Muslim celebrations of Eid, there are almost 3,000 to 4,000 people that actually would go to the mosque for these celebrations. And so another thing that was able to confirm the large size of the Muslim community was actually the expansion of their facility. So when we went, this was the existing mosque that they have. And at that time in 2017, when we went, this was the new Islamic center that was under construction, a very, very large facility to be able to serve the entire community. Recognizing all of this, we decided to investigate the experiences of the Muslim community to understand the community complexity and recognize its needs and document its evacuation experience. So this was the purpose of our research project, and our primary research question was, what were the challenges faced in the situation supporting the wildfire evacuations for members of Fort McMurray's Muslim community? And the way we did that is we conducted qualitative research. We did semi-structured interviews. We went to Fort McMurray, ran 2 focus groups, one of them with community leaders and another with around 30 to 40 people that attended a community focus group, which was very, very informative. We also did informal interviews with public officials and non-government agencies. And just to, this is a picture of myself and my colleague, Jack Rozilski, and one of the residents of Fort McMurray that we were able to interview. And here is a picture of us conducting our focus group. And this is us, with the field observations that helped us to gain understanding of the different evacuation factors. So the way I'm going to present our findings is in 3 distinct phases: prior to the evacuation, during the evacuation, and then finally returned back to Fort McMurray. So when it comes to prior to the evacuation, it was very evident that for the Muslim community, there was generally a lack of emergency preparedness and public awareness of the situation, of just emergency preparedness in general. And beyond the safety training that people were receiving at schools, for example, fire drills or anything with respect to Emergency Preparedness Week, and at work, there was really no other training. So this is just a quote here from one of the residents that we met. It says, during wildfire seasons, we would see the smoke, but we never really thought that it would get to the extent that we would have to evacuate. We didn't really prepare for it. And this is somebody who's been living in Fort McMurray for 8 years. Now, one thing that we recognize is that wildfires happen every single year. So it's an annual occurrence, and you'd see the smoke. People would talk about seeing the smoke, but they never really thought that it was going to enter into the community and cause so much destruction. Another interesting observation was that the Fort McMurray Muslim community is a very tight-knit community. They're very strong relationships amongst one another, but also across Canada, and that really helped during their evacuation. Now, during the evacuation, as the next phase, before we go into presenting our findings here, one of the things that was made very clear to us was that there was an overwhelming appreciation by the people that we met for the emergency social services that they were provided. So much so that there was actually a lot of hesitation for people to answer the questions that we were asking. How is it that your evacuation experience could have been improved, we would ask. And they would say things like, I can't think of any needs or anything that Muslims needed other than a similar place to stay, just like everyone else. Or people are people and all people are Canadian, so there's no difference. We don't want to seem nitpicky. We don't want to look bad. And then another individual said, we were a community that faced a lot of trauma with respect to Islamophobia and certain marginalization. And we don't want to present these things so that people can then say that, look, these Muslims are complaining so much, and then that becomes trauma upon trauma. So it really took a while to get community buy-in, but myself being a Muslim and the relationship that we developed during our time there, that's when people started opening up with respect to their evacuation experiences. So when we look at during the evacuation, we've basically divided our findings into 4 different specific accommodations that were highlighted in our focus groups and interviews. And these are privacy, clothing, food, and spiritual accommodations. So with respect to privacy, outside of family settings and public spaces such as malls or parks, there are varying degrees of gender segregation that Muslims will adhere to. And one thing to remember about Muslims is that they're not by any means a homogeneous group. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. A lot of people will follow things differently and understand things differently. Culture will influence certain things. But no matter where people were on that spectrum, privacy was one of the first things that was mentioned as being an accommodation that they wished could have been improved in some way. So I'll just read you a quote here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was certain private entities that developed group lodging facilities in addition to what the actual provincial emergency social services were providing. And so this is a quote from a mosque in Edmonton that had set up a reception center. And I'll just read you what it says here. So it says, members and volunteers from Al Rashid Mosque started receiving text and phone calls from Fort McMurray residents saying that they were not comfortable staying in such a large open facility. And in particular, this was talking about the Expo Center in Edmonton. And they wanted to sleep at the Al Rashid until the families were able to sort things out. Now, this is one of the focus group participants. She said, the Northlands Exhibition Center had sleeping bags only. And especially if you have a family, that just doesn't work, especially for the sisters. So, if you imagine having a group lodging facility with, thousands of people coming in and, men and women together and families and pets and everyone, the emergency services authorities were trying their best to meet everyone's needs. But privacy was definitely something that some people identified as being lacking, especially for Muslim women, that being an issue for them. Another thing was, having gender segregated or single occupancy washrooms. So if you have certain needs with respect to your dress, for example, and you want to be able to wash your face, but you wear a hijab, you can't really do that if you have co-ed washrooms, which was basically in most areas, that's what was the case, because you have so many people coming in. It's just like the washrooms are for everyone. And so that was identified as an issue. And also having private spaces for breastfeeding. Not a lot of people were able to find corners just to breastfeed comfortably. So that was also highlighted. The next thing is clothing, as that we identified as another area. So, Islamic teachings call for both men and women to observe modesty in their clothing, and how this is understood varies from person to person, and also is very influenced by one's culture. And some practices are applicable to everyone, like not wearing, body conforming clothing, and others are very gender specific. So for men, for example, not wearing shorts that end above the knee, or for women, this could include ensuring that only the face or hands and feet are exposed, such as those people who observe the hijab. Some Muslims also choose to wear culture-specific clothing, whether this is an abaya, which is, for example, an Arabic cloak, the Arabic word for a cloak that women wear as an outer garment, or a shalwar kameez, which is a traditional outfit. And then other Muslims don't follow any guidelines with respect to their clothing. As I mentioned, it's a very heterogeneous group. But it was identified as a need, and I'll just read a quote just to put things into context here. So this is one of our respondents. She says, "They gave us pajamas and t-shirts. Mom wouldn't wear that. The boys it was fine for, but for me, I don't know. I guess it would be okay as an undershirt sort of thing, but it wasn't really something that I would wear. I think that was one of the hardest things we had to deal with, is the amount of clothes. I think Mom had 3 suits, or shalwar kameez, so 3 pairs of clothes. So she was just washing, rotating, and wearing those suits. And so, when people left Fort McMurray, they left. Some had an opportunity to go home and pack some clothes, and others literally they left from work, they left from school, and so you have a community here with certain individuals that just had a lack of clothing, and this girl observes the hijab. So when they would give out t-shirts and pajamas, she wasn't able to wear the short sleeves, for example. And with respect to culture-specific clothing, what ended up happening was a lot of mosques and community centers around the area were able to provide, for example, hijabs or traditional clothing for those individuals. So that outreach with the community ended up being very helpful. Now, food was another observation with respect to their accommodations during the evacuation. So in general, Islamic dietary restrictions include pork and alcohol, but other meats can be consumed, and some will only consume it if it's prepared in a certain way, which makes that meat halal. What ended up happening was there weren't a lot of halal food options that were available, which ended up causing people to eat only vegetarian food, or if there were fish alternatives, they would have that. But I'll just read you a quote here from one family that ended up staying at the University of Calgary residence for the entire month. So from May the 3rd until June the 4th, they were there. And they said, and I'll read the quote, "They tried to do whatever they could, but I think it was just harder for us because everyone else had lots of variety of stuff to eat. Every meal, it would be a different thing. They wouldn't have the same thing 2 days in a row. But for us, it was pretty much the same thing every day. Every meal would be the same thing, and that's what we got tired of. They tried, yeah, but I think it was just harder for us." And so when she was talking about it, she said, initially they were just receiving, eating bread and salad. And when they asked about halal meat, they were able to get some, but it did take a little bit of time. They also were staying at a university residence. So when they were, what they were hoping to do was to be able to use the kitchen facilities there. But there was a sign that says, if the fire alarm goes on, you're going to have a $500 fine. And so there was a lot of hesitation for using those cooking facilities. The other thing that was actually mentioned to us by emergency services authorities was Ramadan. So near the end of that 1 month evacuation, the month of Ramadan began. During the month of Ramadan, Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset. And so what ended up happening was the residents that were there were not able to eat at the designated meal times. So, they would serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then the Muslims were maybe eating dinner around 10 p.m. But that was their entire meal because they hadn't eaten from the night before. So eventually accommodations were made, but what the emergency services authorities were telling us was that if we knew this was the case, we would have perhaps been a bit more proactive and flexible even before. It's just that there was a lack of awareness. And this is what we're hoping to do with this type of research. And then finally, spiritual accommodations. So one thing that was mentioned was to have Islamic counseling. And, we see this in different public facilities and hospitals and in universities. You'll have chaplains. But one thing that was asked as something that would have been helpful was to have Islamic counseling. So I'll just read you a quote here. When we were going through that, there were a lot of emotions, but then there was nothing like counseling for Muslims, especially for my mother and my wife. They were going through a very rough time. And then prayer space. So Muslims who practice prayer will pray 5 times a day. And what's really needed for that is just a clean space and a prayer which normally would go on for 3 to 5 minutes. Of course, you could extend that, but in general, that's the accommodation. So the residents ended up asking authorities to have a space to pray, and there was, people were able to accommodate that, but this was identified as a need. And then hygiene and cleanliness was very important. So, for example, before prayer, Muslims will do a certain cleaning ritual, and so one of the things that was mentioned was that, helping facilitate that level of cleanliness. For example, when you go to the washroom, having a bottle there to clean with water would have been helpful. So those were some of the other things that the residents had mentioned. And then finally, as a last phase was the return to Fort McMurray. So, the community has gone through this experience for an entire month. And then we went 1 year later. And what has the community done as a response? Have they prepared themselves anymore? Have they prepared an emergency kit that they could throw in their bag and leave if this thing happens again? And what we were able to gather when we went was that there was actually limited exposure to new public education campaigns upon their return. And, when we asked, the primary household preparedness change that was made was having a full tank of gas in the car, preparing an easily accessible bag with important belongings, and then discussing an evacuation plan. And for some that didn't have insurance, getting insurance. But that was basically it. The mosque actually did recruit additional volunteers to Fort McMurray's local emergency services department, and including females in that volunteer effort. But then one thing that we are able to do when we were conducting those focus groups was then engage with the community and say, what are some things that you think would have helped the Muslim community, and you in particular, and your friends and family, in the event that something like this happens again. So these were some of the ideas that came up, such as appointing an internal security officer, developing an emergency evacuation plan that was community-wide, assigning a dedicated team to newcomer families. So that was another unfortunate circumstance. So in Fort McMurray, there was 1 or 2 Syrian refugee families that had come into Fort McMurray. And so they had the language limitation because they couldn't understand English really well at that time. And they didn't even realize that an evacuation was happening. So, you have a community that's being evacuated, there's fire everywhere, and then you have this newcomer family that's really, really in the dark as to what's happening. Fortunately, there were some residents in the community that knew of this family. They went there, knocked on their door, and told them that it's time to evacuate. And so another idea would be maintaining an internal registry of Muslims in Fort McMurray with updated contact information and any special needs. So there was circumstances where you had families where the male, the fathers in the family were out in the oil fields doing, their rotation work there. And so you had a mother with her children and she's unable to drive. So how are you supposed to evacuate this family? Unfortunately, she was able to reach out to some friends who were able to come and pick them up and take them away. But in a situation like that, where you have no access to a car, how is it that you can facilitate that? So having a registry of some sort would help. So, what is it, where do we go from here? So we're able to identify some of the needs for the Muslim community, and now we're in a process of sharing these findings with relevant emergency management agencies, so that in the future they can be more proactive and more proactive with their community efforts. But one thing that we were able to realize is that when it comes to the diversity of Canadian cities and communities, you can actually meet needs simultaneously. So, you can eliminate disparities in emergency management services by having very tailored strategies that actually not only are specific to one particular group, but can meet the needs of many at the same time. So, for example, when it comes to the idea of food, now, a lot of the people that we met said, food is not really that important. You can always have vegetarian food. They said, at least you're eating something. It's not, you don't have to have halal meat options. So, the respondents did downplay the need for having halal food options. But one thing that you could do is have greater variety of non-meat options in general. And then this would not only serve individuals across multiple faith groups that abide by religious standards regarding consumption of animal products, but it would also serve those that choose to follow certain dietary practices. So whether you're vegetarian or you're vegan, for example, that could facilitate meeting their needs as well. Another thing is having access to cooking facilities. So, this would decrease the burden on emergency officials to meet specific dietary needs. So oftentimes we do use university residences and they have a kitchenette or a kitchen. So if residents or evacuees are able to use those facilities, a lot of the burden would be removed from ESS personnel. Another idea with respect to privacy. So it doesn't have to be very, very expensive. When we were talking about some of those, the privacy needs that were raised, it's very easy to use partitions that can serve as, partitions or curtains that could divide a large space into different segments. And so this would be helpful for creating private spaces for breastfeeding, for creating gender segregated or family spaces for sleeping. And another idea is to have gender neutral single occupancy washrooms. So this would not only serve those that desire more privacy when it comes to their use of more privacy in general, but for example, having a single occupancy washroom would help those that need more space, for example, persons with disabilities, or would be useful for those that don't identify as falling within a gender binary. So if you could move towards creating those type of, or making those type of washrooms available, it would really help. So, I'm going to conclude the presentation now, but essentially, when we do a deep analysis into specific communities, the way we did here with the Muslim communities, the Muslim community, it can bring about new insights internally and for emergency managers. So, definitely these recommendations go out to emergency managers, but then also when we were asking those questions during the focus groups and we got the community thinking about, yeah, we might need a safety officer or we might need a registry, and it really also helps the community as well. With their own preparation. And then again, it doesn't have to be complicated, and you can meet the needs of multiple groups simultaneously in a very cost-efficient manner. I think there's not a lack of will, just a lack of awareness, I think, especially in Canada. And so in order to have an inclusive approach to emergency management, we believe it's important to conduct similar analyses for other groups. So it just so happened that in Fort McMurray, the Muslim community was the largest visible minority group, but in other circumstances, there may be other groups that we could look at. So that's the end of my presentation. On behalf of Jack Rosilski and myself, thank you for having us, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. I guess I'll just turn off the screen sharing right now. There.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aaida. That was a very informative webinar. From finding out how many Muslims were living in Fort McMurray to how it affected them, because I think for a lot of us, we were focused on, okay, they got out. And, you know, it's amazing with such a devastating fire that destroyed many hectares, billions of dollars lost. And you said that there was not any direct death to the wildfire. So from your research and from your analysis, do you believe that the FFM, the Fort McMurray wildfire evacuation was successful?
Definitely, it was definitely successful. So doing this research, it's not to say that, you know, there was something very, very bad, and this is why we needed to go into the community and do this type of research. So what we tried to do with the Fort McMurray research with the Muslim community was basically just move us beyond the status quo and better prepare, be able to improve our capabilities for meeting the needs of other aspects of, you know, individual community groups. But in general, if you look at the Fort McMurray evacuation, it was successful because, in June 2017, there was a, Portugal wildfires, and that caused, another auto mass emergency evacuation. But they unfortunately had very tragic results. So 250 people were actually injured, and there were many of those who died during that auto evacuation. In the United States, in California, in October 2017, there were wildfires that I'm sure you remember seeing images of in the news. 41 people were killed. So definitely Fort McMurray was a successful evacuation. It really helped because the community demographics is important to consider. It's many had access to vehicles, so they were able to evacuate. It's a very highly educated community as well, an affluent community. So that all of that helped. And it's also very safety oriented because you have the oil sites there, so a lot of safety training for those personnel, and that I guess trickles down to the rest of the community. So it was successful, but with respect to emergency social services, we can always move and improve better and be a leader, hopefully internationally, with respect to how we're able to meet the needs of multiple groups.
Yeah, I mean, you are right. At the end of the day, the kind of research you're doing, it's not just for Muslims per se, because like you said, initially there's a lot of studies where it was focused on the Native community. And then now, though, when it came to the Muslim community, being able to extrapolate and be able, because we can do better at the end of the day, this is the thing, right? We can do better. And how do we make it better? Do you believe some of those lessons, like when you visited them a year later within the Muslim community, have you had any updates if they've incorporated some of the like recommendations that the community had made on a community level, whether it is, it can happen. And then the other thing is there's only one highway, you said, and no gas station for 200 kilometers. Has there been any changes made to accommodate for such issues that could arise?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, because of the devastation that the community faced, there's a lot of focus right now on the rebuilding. And so there's rebuilding all those structures that were affected. And so that has taken priority, but the community officials are definitely aware that additional access in and out of Fort McMurray is required. So there is an effort there. With respect to specifically the Muslim community and its preparation, so our Professor Rozdilsky and myself do plan on revisiting the Muslim community to see how much has been learned. What we've done so far is shared our findings with the people that we interviewed. We're working on developing a community report that can then be distributed to all the community members. And then, hopefully when we go back to visit, maybe, next year or so, we can see whether improvements have been made. But at least for those people that were there and attended our focus groups and that we were able to interview, it has done something, and they have, paid attention to the importance of preparedness.
Do you believe there's cases where meeting the needs of diverse members of the community could become complicated? Because when you're looking at something simple like creating a separation so that there's, it's not just about Muslim women and wanting to observe gender segregation because of they cover, but also for breastfeeding women. Is it because it's complicated, or like why wasn't simple things like a curtain or like a separation barrier put in place?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, at least in Canada, we're very fortunate that it's not a matter of disinterest or purposely not wanting to meet specific needs. It's basically a lack of awareness. So if needs were raised, then emergency social service authorities tried their best to accommodate those needs. But what happens when we do research like this, for example, we've gone into the Muslim community and asked for their experiences, we might go to another community and do similar research, is that you might end up with a situation with conflicting priorities. For example, we mentioned spiritual as a need, and then cleanliness is part of that. So prior to prayer, Muslims will conduct a ritual of cleaning themselves, and they also need to be wearing clean clothes. And so some Muslims believe that the saliva of dogs, for example, is impure, and they will not be in a state of prayer to be able to pray. So in that case, it would say, don't, in order to meet this specific need for the Muslim community, we can't have dogs in an area. But then there are other residents who will not evacuate if they don't have their pets with them. In fact, on the flights that were leaving the oil sites, there were dogs that were, sitting on the laps of their owners. So in this case, what happens as an emergency official, I need to then prioritize specific needs. And of course, in this case, we would, allow pets to be around and dogs to be around so that they can be safely evacuated. So you can get a bit complicated. You can raise expectations when you're meeting with communities and asking them, what are your specific needs? And then if you're unable to meet them, it can cause problems. So it can be a bit complicated, but I think just doing this initial research to find out what are the lived experiences of the multitude of people out there, and what are some practical things we could do to make their experiences better. That's basically where we're coming from.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aaida. That was very informative. I guess the emergency support services that they would have this awareness through this research, but it also us on an individual and a community basis is saying, okay, having that emergency preparedness in place and then being able to share this information beforehand, right? So that, and then to have I guess, when, like you said, if there's competing needs, priority is to evacuate everyone, right? So it really gave us a good understanding how complicated it can be, and where maybe there are gaps where we could improve the situation for everyone. Thank you very much again for this presentation. And so I think the last slide that you had was with you and Dr. Jack.
Yeah, Jack Rozdilsky, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Alcazaz Foundation thanks you both for this presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to your next webinar.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay.